Our repositories are designed to accommodate a shared underlying DB context object. And as we saw whenever we wrote our repositories, there are some times when we check to see if we are sharing a context, and if we aren't, then we go ahead and save the changes or we dispose of that object. But in the cases of where we are sharing it, we are not saving changes and we are not disposing of that object. So we need some way to manage the underlying DB context. And we can write another class to do that for us. In fact, this context controller, if you will, would itself serve as a quasi-context, in that it would give us access to a user repository, a ribbit repository, as well as giving us access to save changes and dispose of the DB context. So let's write an interface. Let's just call it iContext. And this interface is going to declare 3 members. Actually 4, because this needs to also implement iDisposable. A context needs to provide access to an iUser repository. We can call this users. And at the very least, it needs a public getter. We also need an iRibbit repository. We can call this ribbits. And like the user repository, this can be publicly gettable. And then we need a method to save the changes. So this will return an integer, and it will just be called save changes. It's a simple interface, which is going to have a pretty simple implementation. So let's add a class to our project, and let's just call this context. This, of course, needs to implement the iContext interface, and we'll go ahead and let Visual Studio implement those members for us. With our users and ribbits properties, we can kind of cheat in that we can use the get shorthand, and then we can just say private set. That way we don't have to create our own backing fields for those properties. But before we go any further, we need a database context to work with. We also need the user and ribbit repositories. So let's write a constructor so that we can inject those objects. The first parameter will be a DB context object called context. We can go ahead and we can initialize this as null. Next, we could specify an iUser repository, which we will call users. Let's go ahead and set that as null as well. And then the iRibbit repository, which we will set as null. Now, this honestly isn't the best implementation of this constructor, because if these 3 parameters are null, then we are going to create a ribbit database object, a user repository object, and a ribbit repository object. Those 3 classes are specific to our entity framework data store. So if we ever change out those repositories, then we have to address this code, or we need to write a whole new context class. So let's first add a private variable. Let's make this read-only, and this is going to be our DB context. And we'll just call this underscore DB. And then in the constructor, we check to see if our parameters have a value. If we do, then we use those values for our properties and our private variable. Otherwise, we create those objects. Our save changes method is going to be relatively simple. We just simply call underscore DB dot save changes. Dispose is also going to be easy as well. We want to first check if DB is not null. And if it's not null, then we want to call dispose. But we should wrap that call to dispose in a try catch, just in case if there is some type of exception that occurs. So now that we have this context class, we are going to write some services. They are going to be the workhorse of our application. And these services are going to be related to different aspects of our code. Like, for example, we are going to have a security service, which is responsible for all of these security things. Then we will have a user service to do things that are related to users, and one for ribbits, and so on and so forth. And these services are going to consume this context class.